Now we are into innovations in measurement and analysis for the study of terrorism. It is very important to have rigorous and creative methods for collecting and analyzing data. I'm very excited to introduce the presentations here. We have Michael Logan from Kennesaw State University, who PS was in Nebraska last year, to talk about ag security. We have Matt Jensen from University of Oklahoma. He's going to talk about innovation in online behavior measurement threat assessment. And then bringing it up is going to be our own Matt Allen of NCITE. He is an expert on measurement innovation at UNO. So without further ado, Michael, kick us off.
Thanks, Aaron. Again, Michael Logan. So I'm from Kennesaw State University. I'm a criminologist there. And today I'm going to talk about a project where we examined the scope of data sets on domestic terrorism and targeted violence, as well as spoke with Intel analysts about the data-related needs of data sets on terrorism and targeted violence, as well as how we can create more better, useful data sets for those needs. But before I begin, I'd like to thank DHS and NCITE for their support for this project over the past 2 years. And I'd specifically like to thank DHS INA for their support and feedback on our project. Helping craft our project has been critical to making a better product, and really scoping our project, DHS INA has been very useful and helpful. So again, this project has two main objectives, and I'll talk through both of them. Objective one was to examine the scope of data sets on domestic terrorism and targeted violence. What we're looking for is, we know that since 2001, the research on these topics has grown immensely, and we know too the data sets available to us has grown alongside that. And what we want to do is create a repository of those available data sets for Intel analysts. And what we did was screen over 14,000 published articles related to domestic terrorism and targeted violence, and we narrowed those down to 97 data sets that we found. And I'll talk some more about what those look like, what they include, what they're focusing on, as well as some methodological characteristics. And you see there a hyperlink to our year one report. So if you want to see all 97 data sets that we've identified, that can be located in that report. The second objective for our project is we wanted to speak with Intel analysts. We know these data sets are being created. We know academics use them. But what we don't know is if they're being used by DHS analysts and to what extent. And more importantly, if they're not being used, how can we make these data sets better? What are the barriers to access for a lot of these data sets? Again, DHS and their partners are funding these data sets, and we know academics are using them, but are analysts using them? So what we did was create a needs and barriers survey that we distributed to partners in DHS and NCTC. And what I'll be talking about today is a survey that was completed by 12 individuals across DHS and NCTC, most of these using publicly available data sets at a weekly or daily level. So going to, again, objective one, where we're looking at the scope of available data sets, and we found 97 published after 2001, where domestic terrorism or targeted violence was a key outcome, and that had a data set involved. And this is a structured collection of data around a unique body of work. About 30% of the data sets that we found included both transnational and domestic attacks. These things like the Global Terrorism Database. Again, you could find attacks within the United States, but also international attacks as well. Next, about 34% focused just on domestic terrorism. So this is things like the Extremist Crime Database. Only attacks or individuals unique to the United States, does not include international acts within that data set. And finally, 36% were focused on targeted violence. And this could be broken down into several categories. So within that 36, about 10% focused on school shootings, another 10% focused on mass shootings, and a 14% focused on other targeted violence. So this would be things like hate crimes, attacks on specific institutions, churches, abortion service providers, things of that nature. And then finally, within that 1% focused on what we defined as cyber threats, ideologically motivated cyber attacks. And I think this speaks to Gina's points about current gaps within the domestic terrorism and targeted violence space. We also looked at other broad methodological characteristics, so I'll break down three here that we focused on. One, we found that about 25% had a publicly available code book. Again, of these 97, I bet all of them have a available code book, but we couldn't find it. And I think that's a major issue that our project is going to be highlighting. It wasn't easy for us to access the code book, whether it's having to email the researcher or have to some other accessibility issue that prevented us from being able to access the code book related to that data set. Another 78% were free to use, and somewhat this is encouraging, and I'll tell you why I put free in air quotes, because yes, there was no cost involved, but that doesn't mean there weren't barriers to access. Again, this doesn't mean that the data set could just be downloaded and used right away. So while it is beneficial that there wasn't a cost involved in using the data set, we'll talk through more why saying it's free to use and available right away isn't really accurate, because there were many barriers associated with these data sets that Intel analysts spoke to us about. And finally, 40% were updated within the last 5 years. This is somewhat encouraging, as we see that most of these data sets are timely to some extent and have data published between 2018 and 2023. But the downside is if you restrict this time lag to a year or more, I mean, you see this number rapidly decrease. We don't see a lot of data sets that are regularly maintained and provide updates at a monthly or weekly level. So that really focuses on the 97 data sets we found for Objective 1. And again, I encourage you to look at our technical report and to find out more information about things we codified and the 97 data sets that we uncovered. Moving to Objective 2. So this again is the Needs and Barriers Survey. We provided a survey to 12 Intel analysts across DHS and NCTC. And one of the questions that we asked was, what are some data-related issues that are most problematic for you in your job? And we used 10-point Likert scales, ranging from, again, not problematic at all to highly problematic. And we gave them a battery of data-related issues, things like accessibility, cost, methodological transparency. And we found 4 categories that really emerged as being problems with publicly available data sets on domestic terrorism and targeted violence. The first being accessibility issues. There was major issues with barriers to access, waiting for approval, having to enter information and wait for approval from the data set developer to give you access. Do you have to email the researcher? If it's not easily find, if you can't easily find it online, do you have to email somebody to get access, right? That creates a lag or an accessibility issue. Or just not being able to find the data. You can find an article about it, but where is the actual data set and can it be used? Second was inconsistent or irregular updates. Again, data sets with long lag periods. They're not being updated regularly. There's a year or more lag between when the data is released. Again, they're not providing those timely updates, which Intel analysts are showing us that they really appreciate and need for their sort of work. Next, limited scope. So these are data sets that only focused on one ideology, one target type, or a singular event. Analysts want data sets that are more broad, comprehensive, that they might be able to narrow, but that researchers aren't specifically narrowing for their purposes. And finally, poor methodological transparency. And I think this speaks to the limited amount of code books we can find in those 97 data sets. That a lot of data sets had no code book, they had unclear definitions of domestic terrorism and targeted violence. Overall, we just couldn't find inclusion criteria. They were unable to find detail about the data and how the data set was constructed. So again, fulfilling Objective 1, identifying those data sets, we found 97, and we're categorizing them now based on a number of methodological items that we've gotten feedback from DHS and NCTC about, and then talking about the survey and those findings, how that's setting us up to inform researchers about how to create more useful data sets. So what are the implications here? Number one, researchers need to develop a data management plan that focuses on updating the data, providing those monthly or weekly updates, or providing accessible data. Again, does this mean it's free to use? Does this mean it's easy to download? Those are things that should be considered when creating data sets. And I think this is important for researchers. We go through all these decision makings about how to defining our data, what we're interested in, key variables, whether that's domestic terrorism or targeted violence. But we need to think about how it's accessible and useful to Intel analysts. Again, they're the ones funding this data, and we need to consider their needs when crafting these data sets. Second, researchers could need to consider creating a data sheet or an executive summary or a research note about their data set. When it's crafted, just creating some short note about Again, what time frame does this cover? What is the inclusion criteria? This doesn't need to be something long, maybe just a one-pager. Researchers at Microsoft have been pushing this idea of data sheets for data sets that should correspond when any data set is published. And I think social sciences sort of lag in this area, but in the more technological fields, they are do a better job at providing those sort of data-related access points. And so I think it's key as we move forward in crafting these data sets on domestic terrorism and targeted violence, we need to create these data sheets, again, to provide easy-to-access information about how the data was constructed, and again, key decision points while creating that data set. And then finally, stakeholders. DHS should prioritize data sets that are useful to intel analysts. Again, if we're going to identify high-performing, useful data sets, then we need to allocate resources to those that are used. We need to maintain those data sets. If analysts are using them, we need to provide funds to keep those maintained, provide those updates, and make it accessible. If it's going to be free, we should, again, fund those data sets to researchers to be able to use. Again, data sets that meet the mark for analysts should be prioritized within this space. Thank you.
Okay. I hope you all can hear me. I can hear myself, so I take that as a good sign. My name is Matt Jensen. I'm from the University of Oklahoma, and it's a pleasure for me to be with you. I am joined here by a number of our team, and I just want to give a quick shout out. I think those that are PIs that work with NCITE really benefit from the association that we all feel as PIs, but also from the teams and the collaborations that we've been able to establish. So here we have Aris, Boyra Lopez, Cecilia Gordon, and also Joe Stewart. They're graduate students at the University of Oklahoma. And I also want to give a shout out to my co-PIs, Shane Connolly and Hairong Song. What I'm going to be talking about today is the culmination of a lot of years of work. And so we're coming up on the 4th year of our project working with NCITE, and we've been studying online extremism and the rhetoric that online groups engage in to solidify support, recruit members, and mobilize toward offline activities, in many cases violence. But my purpose here today is to talk a little bit about the methods that we use. And so if you want findings, if you want some of the conclusions that we've been working on, I'll be happy to talk with you about those. We've published a lot of reports and conference papers and other publications. And we actually have a couple of posters out right outside this room, so I'd invite your attention there. But for the purpose of this presentation, I want to talk about methods. And I want to set this up in the context of our study. And so our overall goal, I think, is a goal that we all share, and that is, detecting and disrupting threats, right? Making sure that the public is safe, and making sure that the Department of Homeland Security and other stakeholders can fulfill their mission to safeguard citizens. And the problem that we have identified and that we focus all of our attention on has to do with ideological groups, and as they mobilize toward violence, as they use things like identities and issues, and even the promotion of violence through their rhetoric, how this increases commitment to extremism and also mobilizes toward violence. But this turns out to be a very difficult topic to study. And the reason for the difficulty is nuanced and I think multi-pronged. What we want to do, right, is we want to establish understanding and understanding specifically around those things that precipitate or contribute to the violence that we observe in offline circumstances. Okay, so that's kind of our goal. So to accomplish this goal, right, we have numerous methods that exist, but each has its benefits and its drawbacks, and I just want to talk for a minute about some of these things. A lot of this is not going to be new for many in this room. But I think it's important for all of us to kind of be on the same page about what the weaknesses and benefits are of different methods of inquiry so that we can understand exactly what we know and why we know it, okay? Also, I think it's also relevant, and I guess I point this out as a way of kind of hooking back in with some conversation and some discussion that took place in the last panel yesterday. There was a question about the importance of theory, right, and what theory can provide. And I want to come back to that because when we talk about how we know things, this is intimately connected with the discussion of theory, right, and the utility that theory gives us in making predictions about what we think is going to happen in a certain circumstance. Because the value of theory is prediction, okay? And prediction in similar circumstances to what we've already experienced, but also in novel circumstances. So, how do we know what we know? How do we build theory? There are a couple of different ways. And this, I acknowledge, is a gross simplification, but I think it illustrates the point, because we have a couple of trade-offs that we have to make when we engage in inquiry and when we advance theory. So, when we engage in theory development or in extending what we know about a certain phenomenon, we can collect data and draw conclusions a number of different ways. The first is probably going to be observational. And in our context, this is what we often do. So, for example, when we examine online rhetoric, what we do is we monitor extremist groups and pay attention to what they say, okay? So we call this the analysis of trace data. We go out to social media, we go out to their own web properties, we look at platforms that they own, and we examine the rhetoric that's out there. So this has a number of benefits. Probably the first benefit is that, this is actual behavior that members of these groups are actually engaging in. The problem, though, is that when we try to draw associations or conclusions about what this data tell us, we're limited. Okay? We can see what the groups are doing. We can see that these things co-occur with other phenomena that we're very interested in, for example, offline violence or mobilization toward violence. But that's the limit of the conclusions that we can draw, right? So we're limited by association. It's not necessarily cause and effect. As we continue down, though, we have some other tools available to us. We can engage in interviews, we can engage in surveys, we can engage in case studies, we can explore the deep contextual understanding that we need to really probe a phenomenon. We have participated in some of this ourselves, where we've gone out and interviewed individuals who pay attention to and study extreme online groups. And this carries with it a number of benefits, right? We have deep contextual understanding and by the actual participants in the phenomenon that we're studying. But there are also some drawbacks, right? Gaining access to these individuals tends to be extremely difficult. There aren't too many members of online extremist groups that want to talk to the people at University of Oklahoma about what they're doing and why they're doing it, especially if they engage in violence. We also have some bias, right, where we are limited in the perspectives that they give us. But in addition to that, we also have problems around generalizability. So how well does something generalize from one particular context to another? So if we're talking to a specific online group or to a specific group of people who are monitoring online behavior and rhetoric, how well does that generalize to other phenomena, other contexts? Now, finally, we have experiments. And this is something that I have a lot of background in, something that I pay particular close attention to. I think there's a lot of elegance that comes from experiments. We conduct experiments in our own group. And a typical example of this would be a traditional randomized controlled experiment that we would perform in a lab. There are other examples. Field experiments are certainly in this category, as are natural experiments. And one of the core benefits of performing experiments is the ability to establish causality. We can say, on the basis of randomization and control, this thing causes something else, okay? Now, with that benefit comes a bunch of drawbacks, and this is something that we're also intimately familiar with. First is realism, right? When we talk about online or extremism, online extremism, there's a limit to the realism that we can recreate inside of the lab. Getting access to the people that we're really interested in studying also poses a problem for us. And one of the other things, we also have, federal regulations that determine protections that human subjects should enjoy in this country. And so, exposing them to really heinous kinds of online rhetoric is not something that we do, even though this kind of rhetoric exists in the real world. So these are important drawbacks that we face when we think about drawing conclusions and choosing methods to draw those conclusions and establishing understanding around online extremism. Now, one of the things that we've done is tried to combine these different techniques in a way that compensates for the weaknesses of an individual method of inquiry. And so we've adopted a mixed methods approach. And our mixed method approach, at least the one that we've been using for the last 4 years, combines observational data collection with experiments. Now, the benefit of this is that obviously we combine strengths, right? We can see what's actually going on, and we can test that in a controlled environment in the lab. However, mixed methods also have drawbacks, right? You don't get anything for free. And it's important to be truthful and upfront about what those drawbacks are. The first drawback is that it's slow, right? It just takes time to do. Understanding what's going on in real life, studying trace data, bringing that over, recreating as much as we're able in the lab, and then running experiments, having subjects go through those experiments, it just takes time. The other drawback, though, that we see from mixed methods is the diversity of skills that are required. And this is something that I think other PIs in this group probably struggle with also, combining teams, creating teams that are going to be sufficiently skilled to be able to answer the questions that you have, right? So in our team, for example, we have IO psychology represented. We have machine learning and data analytics that's represented. We have organizational expertise. We have data modelers. And we've had a number of different graduate students that have come on and off that have provided a whole bunch of ad hoc skills that we've needed. And engaging in this has been able to support our mixed method approach. Now, I want to talk for just a minute about some of the fruits that have come out of this mixed method approach. This is kind of the path that we've followed in our own inquiry. I mentioned before that we've engaged in observational data collection. What that usually entails is gathering and manually labeling huge data corpuses. So we gather these from online platforms. We apply all kinds of automated analyses to understanding, what the rhetoric is telling us, the different camps and factions that exist in the discourse, and what the discourse is ultimately building toward. We apply all different kinds of machine learning and AI tools to this study, but then we bring these phenomena into the lab and dissect them in a way that allows us to say, this particular aspect of rhetoric is going to cause this in observers. So that's been our approach. Let me give you just a couple of examples of some of the findings, and then I'll be done. So first is the incidence of multivocality in messaging. And so this is something that we see commonly with commercial entities, especially in their marketing efforts. But this was something that we observed that extremist groups online are doing. They talk in different terms, using different strategies to different segments of their audiences across different platforms. And so we brought this phenomenon into the lab and we discovered, customized messages are clearly superior in a couple of different ways. They're recalled better, they're easier to disseminate, and these things gain traction. The problem, though, is that this has detrimental effects for credibility. Another example that we saw has to do with moral disengagement. And so these are tactics that numerous extremist groups engage in, where they try to justify their own extremist positions. And so we noticed through our observation the use of moral disengagement. And so we brought moral disengagement into the lab insofar as we were able, subject to human subjects protections, and systematically studied what the effects of moral disengagement were. And one of the things that we saw was the use of moral disengagement, but also calling out and potentially countering moral disengagement promoted polarization among the participants in our study. Those that were sympathetic to the cause became more sympathetic. Those that were not became even more so. So those are two examples of what we saw. And I guess I offer that to you as kind of the fruits of a multi-method study and a multi-method area of inquiry. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Really excited to be here and to be on the stage with this distinguished panel. So my name is Matt Allen, and as Aaron mentioned at the beginning, I'm at NCITE. I'm the head of measurement innovation, and I'm also a professor in the College of Business Administration here at UNL. So let me jump right into my talk here. So what are we going to be covering today? As we saw from the last panel, a lot has been written about locally based TBTP types of programs and some of the limitations with that research. There's been lots of calls for better evaluation of these types of programs. So what I'm going to be doing today is taking a step back and kind of asking the question, what are we missing? So from a big picture perspective, what are the things that we need to be thinking about that we're not when it comes to evaluating the efficacy of TBTP programs? So I'm going to talk about 4 opportunities that I see in this area, and those are listed above, and I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. But first, some background. So NCITE over the last few years has undertaken some research and several efforts around the evaluation of TBTP programs. In 2022, we wrote a memo to the House Committee on Homeland Security on the state of science in TBTP efforts. And then currently we have several streams of work and contracts to evaluate DHS-funded TBTP efforts in support of the Evidence Act. So we have a lot of evaluation work going on here. And as part of that, we've reviewed hundreds of articles systematically, and we also reviewed 17 evaluation toolkits. So what are those? So evaluation toolkits, we have identified 17 toolkits online in different places that are meant to help practitioners or help policymakers or help program evaluators to evaluate TBTP programs specifically. So there's 17 of those out there. And we have a separate paper that I can share for anybody that wants the details of that study. But the point I want to make here when we were reviewing those evaluation toolkits and reviewing all those articles is, if you look at what we define as success, what does success actually mean? There are literally hundreds of different metrics that are used, that are included in those toolkits, or they are in different studies, different ways of measuring things. So even if you are measurement inclined or you have a measurement background, it'd be very hard to say, what are the things that I should be paying attention to? What are the things that I should care about when I'm thinking about evaluating this program of inquiry? And so that led us to ask the question, what are we missing? So let's take a step back from some of the day-to-day work that we're doing. I'm going to mention that even though these are some kind of high-level thoughts, and I'm not going to be presenting results today, there are a lot of people that I've been working with over the years that have definitely informed this. I'll give a shout out to Andrea Walker. She's in the back there, who for the last 2 years we've had conversations about this topic, and that's really inspired some of the content of this presentation here. So let me get into the 4 opportunities that I see here. First opportunity, addressing the criterion problem. What do I mean by that? There is a classic study in the organizational sciences called the criterion problem. And that criterion problem is really recognizing two things. Number one is that we need to systematically study the dependent variable that we want to predict or we want to change. It should be an area of inquiry of its own. We need to focus on that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is recognizing that that's not an easy thing to do. So again, this term, the criterion problem, comes from organizational sciences. And so for example, if you're trying to build knowledge about what makes people more productive or increases well-being within an organization, recognizing that there's a lot of complexity there. There's different jobs. There's different jobs like sales jobs or managerial jobs or whatever it is. And so how do we build knowledge that cuts across all those different domains or all those different situations? There's different organizations. They're in different geographical locations. So it's recognizing that we need to laser focus and do systematic work to actually define what the quote-unquote criterion space is, basically your dependent variables. So how was this addressed in the organizational sciences, and what does this mean for measuring prevention programming? So the first thing that came out of this was an emphasis on behaviors, okay? So behavioral models. So what is it? It's when there is some kind of intervention or something that you're doing, we're not focusing, attitudes can be something, beliefs, those are things that we would focus on. We also might care about, organizational performance and, what this intervention means for organizational performance. But the key thing that a lot of these interventions are focused on is behavior. What people can do and what they will do differently after the intervention, before the intervention and then after the intervention, okay? So what this led to was a lot of taxonomic work on these behaviors and how they should be clustered together, okay, and how we treat them together. The second thing is it identified core contextual dependencies. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that there are certain components or certain things that you can measure in the organization that have a lot of effect on whether an intervention works for different types of populations. So in organizations, for example, more complex jobs that are more cognitively demanding, those have different interventions than ones that are less cognitively demanding. Okay, so it identifies those core contextual dependencies. So what's the point that I'm trying to make here? When we see recommendations for locally based TVTP programs, there's often the recommendation that those programs should be localized, that it should be built to the local context. Yes, but if we're changing both the intervention and we're changing the dependent variable, how we measure it, then it's very hard to build a corpus of knowledge. Okay, we have to fix one of those a little bit more, or at least have a shared understanding of one side of that equation in order to start building knowledge. So that's where working on the criterion problem solves. Stated another way is the outcomes, we should be thinking about what do we want to achieve? What does success look like? And have that drive the programming. The natural inclination is to say, I have this program or we have this intervention. How do we evaluate that program? But we should be thinking about what do we want to achieve and then work backwards from there. So that's the first opportunity that I see, is working on the criterion problem, and that's a thing that we can work on systematically. Second opportunity, robust measurement methods. So Dr. Bader gave a great, I think he's in the back there, I saw him earlier. Dr. Bader gave a great presentation yesterday on the importance of measurement and the importance of being very deliberate in the choice and how you measure things and how you assess things. Because he gave that presentation yesterday about different measurement methods meant that we couldn't really understand the phenomena that we're actually trying to study here. So we need to be really deliberate about that. So the other point I want to make is when we're thinking about TVTP types of programs, these locally based prevention programs, we're often relying on short-term outcomes for evaluation. So what do I mean by that? You have an intervention, and the best opportunity to collect information about the efficacy of it is right after. Maybe it's within a few days, maybe it's directly after. So we're relying on these short-term outcome measures. And sometimes we can collect data later on and longitudinally, but oftentimes, especially in applied settings, we can't, or it's very difficult to do. So we want to make sure if we have these short-term outcome measures that these be really, really good, that these be really good measures that we can rely on to help inform inform these different programs. So it's critical that these instruments, and I've got a few bullet points up there, capture the complexity of the behavior being measured. So if you're trying to measure whether somebody's behavior is going to change, or if they have knowledge about something within a complex domain, like, or within a complex system, like out in the, out in their communities, you have to have complexity in the way that you measure that as well. We need to account for socially desirable responding. A lot of survey-based methods, if we're asking people directly, especially if it's something that's done right after an intervention, they may want to say something to sort of please the people who are conducting that intervention. So we have to be cognizant of that. And then third, we want something that will predict longer-term the longer-term outcomes of interest. So, and I'm going to give an example question here, just an example of one of these more complex items. This is called a situational judgment test, and this is an item for assessing resilience, individual resilience. It's published in the citation that's up there. What I want to point out is that this scenario has, you can convey more complex scenarios in here, okay? So we can have a lot of complexity in the scenarios, and we can also have complexity in the response options where there aren't as many easy answers, and the way that the scoring is done is it can be like sort of gradations of effectiveness of each one of the options there. And because it's still a forced choice type of measure, we are able to, it can scale up a wider range. So, so while this is a question about resilience, you can easily see how this might apply to, for example, scenarios about somebody exhibiting behaviors of concern, what you would do in those situations, and so building measures along those lines. Third opportunity, creatively building control into programming. I did not realize that Matt's presentation would tee this point up as well as it does, so thank you, Matt, for unintentionally helping me here. But when we're working in an applied context, it can be very difficult to determine causation. And so oftentimes what's recommended in these, and what we do in these situations to start inferring causation, is to collect baseline information. So for example, maybe you have an outreach campaign and you assess how knowledgeable people are about something, and then you measure how knowledgeable they are or how aware they are of something right after that, right? So you have kind of that pre-post test. But there are other ways that we can help increase the causal inference within those studies. So so oftentimes when we think about whether there's causation, we think about it as a yes-no kind of thing. Yes, it inferred causation, or no, it didn't infer causation. But it's actually a gradation. We can collect additional or design things to get a stronger inference of causation. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can build control into this. I'm going to just give one example here, but imagine that you're doing that same outreach campaign. You do the pre-test, you do the post-test, but in the pre-test and in the post-test, you include things that were not part of the outreach campaign, right? So you include things, these are called non-equivalent dependent variables, right? And so what you should see if your outreach campaign is the thing that's actually, causing or actually what drove people's changes in opinions, what you should see is that the thing that was part of your outreach campaign should go up, but the other things may stay flat or would stay the same, okay? And that's another way where we can add some causal inference. These are called quasi-experimental designs. The reason it tees up on Matt's is because it's the one area that he did not mention in there. So, so thank you, Matt, for, no, you're good. Okay, the fourth one. Rather than going through what I have on this slide, I'm going to just convey a conversation that I had with Meg last night, Meg McBride. So she's doing a program evaluation study right now, and it was kind of a complex design and small n that had a lot of issues. What she did is she went to other people in her organization who were doing evaluations in other domains and asked them, hey, how would you tackle this problem? And not nobody had like a silver bullet kind of answer to it. But Meg was able to pick and choose, some of the insights from the different places and start applying it to the context that she had. So the point that I want to make here is that TVTP is inherently interdisciplinary. When we think about the interventions, that's interdisciplinary, but we can also be interdisciplinary in how we measure it. A lot of the problems that we face in TVTP, like low base rates, complex systems, these are faced in other domains, okay? We can learn a lot from other domains and other disciplines that face similar issues, so we just need to, but we need to be deliberate about going out and reaching out to those experts, So I am over time, so I'm just gonna end here by again acknowledging the research team and where do we go from here. I'll just focus on this first bullet point, which is focused research on the dependent variables, on the criterion space. Okay, so that we need to have some deliberate effort towards that, how we define success, and then we'll be able to really start building knowledge in these TVTP programs. Thank you.